How Was London in 1801? A comprehensive historical documentary. Chapter 1. A City on the Brinks of Transformation. The year 1801 marked a pivotal moment in London's extraordinary history. As the clock struck midnight on January 1st of that year, London awoke not merely to a new century, but to a dramatically transformed political reality. The Act of Union had just come into effect, merging the Kingdom of Great Britain with the Kingdom of Ireland to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. London, already the largest city in Europe, now stood as the capital of an expanded empire that stretched across continents and oceans. To understand London in 1801, one must first grasp the sheer magnitude of what this city represented. With a population hovering around 1 million souls, London was the most populous city in the Western world. It had surpassed Beijing and Constantinople to claim the title of the world's largest metropolis. This was a city bursting at its seams, a place where medieval streets struggled to accommodate the pressing demands of modernity, where ancient traditions collided daily with the inexorable forces of change. The London of 1801 was a city of stark contradictions. Within its boundaries, one could witness the most magnificent displays of wealth and privilege alongside the most abject poverty and misery. Grand mansions stood mere streets away from fetid slums. Elegant carriages bearing aristocrats to exclusive social engagements shared cobblestone roads, with carts hauling refuse, and the desperate poor seeking any means of survival. King George III occupied the throne, though his reign had been marked by considerable turbulence. The loss of the American colonies remained a fresh wound in the national consciousness, and the ongoing wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France consumed enormous resources and dominated political discourse. The king himself had suffered bouts of mental illness that had shaken public confidence in the monarchy, though in 1801 he appeared to have recovered sufficiently to resume his duties. The political atmosphere was charged with tension and uncertainty. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger had recently resigned over the question of Catholic emancipation, which he had promised to the Irish as part of the Union negotiations. The king's staunch refusal to grant Catholics political rights had forced Pitt's hand, and Henry Addington had assumed the premiership in March of 1801. This political upheaval reflected deeper divisions within British society regarding religion, representation, and the proper ordering of political power. London served as the nerve center of an expanding commercial empire. The Port of London handled more trade than any other port in the world. Ships arrived daily, bearing goods from every corner of the globe: sugar from the Caribbean, tea from China, spices from India, timber from the Baltic, and countless other commodities that fed the insatiable appetite of British consumers and merchants. This commercial supremacy generated enormous wealth, much of which flowed through London's counting houses, banks, and mercantile establishments. The city's geography in 1801 differed markedly from what we know today. The ancient city of London, that square mile governed by its own corporation and Lord Mayor, remained the commercial heart of the metropolis. Westminster, to the west, housed the institutions of national government, Parliament, the royal court, and the great offices of state. Between these two poles stretched the Strand, one of the most important thoroughfares in the kingdom, lined with shops, coffee houses, and the town residences of the nobility. Beyond these central districts, London sprawled outward in an irregular pattern of development. To the north, the parish of Marylebone was experiencing rapid growth, with elegant squares and terraces attracting wealthy residents seeking escape from the increasingly crowded older neighborhoods. To the east, beyond the Tower of London, the districts of Wapping, Shadwell, and Limehouse housed the maritime population that serviced the Great Port. To the south, across the river, Southwark maintained its ancient reputation for entertainment and vice, while newer developments along the Surrey shore brought residential expansion to areas previously given over to market gardens and industry. The Thames River served as the city's great artery, the source of much of its prosperity and power. In 1801, only 3 bridges spanned the river within the metropolitan area: London Bridge, Westminster Bridge, and Blackfriars Bridge. London Bridge, the oldest and most venerable of these crossings, had been stripped of the houses and shops that had lined it for centuries, presenting a more utilitarian appearance than in previous eras. The lack of bridges meant that much cross-river traffic relied upon ferrymen, who plied their trade from numerous stairs and landing places along both banks. The river itself presented a spectacle that no visitor could ignore. Thousands of vessels crowded its waters. Great merchantmen from distant ports, coastal traders bringing coal and provisions, lighters and barges transporting goods to and from the wharves, and pleasure craft bearing passengers on errands of business or recreation. The famous Pool of London, that stretch of river below London Bridge, where seagoing ships anchored and unloaded, was described by contemporaries as a floating forest of masts, so dense were the vessels concentrated there. Chapter 2: Streets, Buildings, and Neighborhoods. The physical fabric of London in 1801 represented an accumulation of centuries of building and rebuilding. The Great Fire of 1666 had destroyed much of the medieval city, leading to reconstruction in brick and stone, rather than the timber-framed structures that had previously predominated. However, beyond the boundaries of the old city, many areas retained their pre-fire character, with narrow, winding streets and buildings of various ages jumbled together in picturesque confusion. The streets of London in 1801 were, by modern standards, almost unimaginably difficult to navigate. Paving was inconsistent in quality and coverage. The main thoroughfares might be surfaced with granite setts or cobblestones, but many secondary streets remained unpaved or poorly maintained. Pedestrians picked their way through mud, refuse, and the ever-present horse dung that accumulated from the thousands of horses that provided the city's primary means of transportation. Street lighting was provided by oil lamps, maintained by lamplighters, who made their rounds at dusk to ignite the wicks and at dawn to extinguish them. The quality of illumination was poor by later standards, and large areas of the city remained in darkness during the night hours. This contributed to the genuine dangers of nocturnal travel, as footpads and thieves exploited the shadows to prey upon unwary pedestrians. The buildings of London displayed enormous variety. The grandest structures included the great public edifices. St. Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren's Baroque masterpiece, completed in 1711, dominated the city skyline with its magnificent dome. Westminster Abbey housed the tombs of monarchs and the great of the realm. The Houses of Parliament, not yet the Gothic revival structure we know today, occupied the old Palace of Westminster with its medieval and Tudor fabric. The Tower of London, ancient fortress and royal prison, maintained its grim watch over the eastern approaches to the city. The aristocracy and gentry inhabited elegant townhouses in the fashionable West End. Mayfair had emerged as the most exclusive residential district, its streets and squares lined with substantial residences built in the classical style that had dominated English architecture since the late 17th century. Grosvenor Square, Berkeley Square, and Hanover Square attracted the highest ranks of society, while slightly less exclusive addresses in St. James's and Piccadilly housed the merely wealthy and well-connected. The emerging middle class found accommodation in newer developments to the north and west. Bloomsbury offered respectable addresses at somewhat lower cost than Mayfair, while the areas around Russell Square and Bedford Square attracted professional men and their families seeking comfortable domesticity within reach of the city's commercial districts. The working classes inhabited a vastly different urban landscape. In the crowded lanes of the East End, families crammed into small rooms in ancient, decaying buildings. Sanitation was primitive or non-existent, fresh water was scarce and often contaminated, the air hung heavy with the smells of human habitation, industrial activity, and the ever-present effluvia of the river. Disease flourished in these conditions, and mortality rates in the poorest districts far exceeded those in the healthier western reaches of the metropolis. The industrial activities of London in 1801 were dispersed throughout the urban fabric. Breweries, tanneries, soapworks, and countless small manufacturing establishments operated alongside residential properties. The concept of zoning had not yet emerged, and the noxious byproducts of industry mingled freely with the daily lives of urban residents. Some of the most offensive trades concentrated along the river to the east, where access to water for industrial processes combined with distance from fashionable neighborhoods to permit operations that would not have been tolerated elsewhere. Markets formed essential nodes in the city's daily life. Covent Garden, originally a produce market, had expanded to become a major center for fruit, vegetables, and flowers. Smithfield, to the north of the city, served as the principal livestock market, with cattle, sheep, and pigs driven through the streets to their fate. Billingsgate on the riverfront was the great fish market, famous for the colorful language of its porters and vendors. Leadenhall served the poultry trade, while numerous smaller markets scattered throughout the metropolis supplied the daily needs of local residents. The coffee houses of London, though past their 17th century peak of influence, remained important centers of commercial and social life. Lloyd's Coffee House had evolved into the world's premier insurance market. Jonathan's Coffee House had given birth to the stock exchange. Numerous other establishments catered to specific trades and professions, providing venues for the transaction of business and the exchange of news and gossip. The churches of London were numerous beyond counting. Every parish had its church, from the magnificent structures designed by Wren after the Great Fire, to humble medieval survivals and recent constructions serving new communities. Religion remained central to public life, and church attendance, while perhaps declining from earlier peaks, still structured the weekly rhythms of most Londoners' lives. Chapter 3: Society and Social Classes. The Society of London in 1801 was rigidly hierarchical, yet paradoxically fluid, in ways that distinguished England from its continental neighbors. At the apex stood the aristocracy, those fortunate few who held hereditary titles and whose families had accumulated vast estates and political power over generations. Below them ranked the gentry, untitled landowners, whose social position derived from the ownership of rural property and the income it generated. The aristocracy maintained an annual pattern of movement between their country estates and their London residences. The social season, roughly coinciding with the sitting of Parliament from early in the year until summer, brought the great families to town. During these months, the West End sparkled with balls, dinner parties, and assemblies. Young ladies of good family were presented at court and launched upon the marriage market. Young gentlemen sought preferment, pleasure, and suitable matches. The older generation renewed political alliances and social connections, while keeping watchful eyes upon their offspring. The middle classes of London in 1801 comprised a diverse and growing segment of urban society. This category encompassed successful merchants, whose wealth might rival that of many noble families, professional men such as lawyers, physicians, and clergy, lesser traders and shopkeepers, clerks and accountants, who staffed the counting houses of commercial enterprises, and countless others who lived by their wits, their skills, and their labor without descending to the status of the laboring poor. These middling sorts occupied an increasingly important position in London's social and economic life. They provided the goods and services that made urban existence possible. They staffed the institutions of commerce, finance, and government that gave London its importance. They aspired to respectability, sought to educate their children, and hoped for advancement to higher stations. Their numbers were growing, and their collective influence was beginning to reshape English society in ways that would become fully apparent only in the Victorian era to follow. The laboring classes formed the great majority of London's population. These were the men and women who performed the physical work upon which the city's prosperity depended. They unloaded ships, built buildings, made and sold goods, cleaned streets, carried sedan chairs, tended horses, cooked meals, washed clothes, and performed the countless tasks that kept the metropolis functioning. Their lives were characterized by hard work, limited resources, and constant uncertainty. For the laboring poor, existence in London was precarious. Employment was often casual and irregular. Wages, while perhaps higher than in rural areas, barely sufficed to meet the elevated cost of urban living. Housing was crowded and unhealthy. Food was expensive and sometimes adulterated. Illness could strike at any time, bringing not only suffering, but the loss of income upon which survival depended. Below the respectable working class existed a substantial population that lived on the margins of legality and decency. Beggars thronged the streets, displaying their infirmities to elicit charity from passers-by. Prostitutes plied their trade openly in certain districts, tolerated by authorities who lacked either the means or the will to suppress them. Thieves, pickpockets, and confidence men preyed upon the unwary. Fences received and disposed of stolen goods through networks of remarkable sophistication. The treatment of poverty in London reflected contemporary attitudes that combined Christian charity with suspicion of the idle and dissolute. The old poor law system, administered through the parishes, provided minimal assistance to those deemed deserving of relief. Workhouses offered shelter and sustenance in return for labor, though conditions were deliberately made harsh to discourage dependence. Private philanthropy supplemented public provision, with numerous charitable institutions offering aid to specific categories of the deserving poor. Women's position in London society reflected the broader patriarchal structures of Georgian England. Legal rights for women were severely limited. Upon marriage, a woman's property became her husband's. Divorce was virtually impossible, except for the very wealthy, who could obtain private acts of parliament at enormous expense. Educational opportunities for women were limited, and professional occupations largely closed to them. Nevertheless, women played vital roles in London's economic and social life. Working-class women labored in domestic service, in markets and shops, in manufacturing, and in numerous other occupations. Middle-class women managed households, raised children, and maintained the social connections upon which family prosperity depended. Women of the upper classes, while constrained by convention, could exercise considerable influence through their salons, their patronage, and their carefully managed social activities. Children in London faced circumstances that varied enormously according to the accidents of birth. The children of the wealthy received education, either at home through tutors and governesses, or at the great public schools for boys. They enjoyed leisure, comfort, and the expectation of inheriting their parents' social position. The children of the poor, by contrast, often began working at very young ages, contributing their small earnings to family survival, while forfeiting the education and leisure that might have improved their prospects. Chapter 4. Daily Life and Culture. Daily life in London in 1801 followed patterns shaped by the seasons, the clock, and the demands of work and social obligation. For the upper classes, the day might begin late, particularly during the social season when balls and assemblies extended into the early morning hours. Gentlemen might spend their afternoons at their clubs, attending to business, or visiting friends. Ladies received callers, paid visits, shopped, and prepared for the evening's entertainments. Dinner, the main meal of the day for the wealthy, was served in the early evening and might extend for hours, followed by cards, music, or other diversions. The working classes operated on an entirely different schedule. Labor began early, often at dawn or before, and continued until darkness made work impossible. The working day of 12 or 14 hours was common, with only Sunday offering respite from toil. Meals were simple and taken quickly. Bread, cheese, and beer forming the staples of the working class diet, supplemented when means permitted by meat, vegetables, and other provisions. Food in London reflected both the city's commercial connections and the limitations of contemporary preservation and distribution. Fresh produce from the market gardens that surrounded the metropolis supplied fruits and vegetables in season. Meat came from the great livestock markets, where animals were slaughtered fresh for consumption. Fish arrived daily from the coast and from the Thames itself, which still supported a fishing industry despite increasing pollution. The preservation of food remained a challenge. Without refrigeration, perishable goods required quick consumption. Salting, smoking, and pickling extended the life of certain products. Ice, harvested in winter and stored in ice houses, provided limited cooling for wealthy households and commercial establishments. Adulteration of food was common, with unscrupulous vendors adding harmful substances to stretch supplies or improve appearance. Clothing marked social status as clearly as any other indicator. The wealthy wore garments of fine wool, silk, linen, and cotton, tailored to their measurements, and following the latest fashions from Paris, even though war made direct contact with French fashion centers difficult. Men of fashion wore tight breeches, embroidered waistcoats, and elaborate cravats. Women wore high-waisted gowns in the neoclassical style that had emerged in the 1790s, with relatively simple lines that represented a dramatic departure from the hooped skirts and elaborate structures of earlier decades. The working classes wore more practical garments, suited to their labor and their means. Wool and coarse linen predominated, with clothing often second-hand or made at home. The expense of textiles meant that working people owned few garments, wearing them until they fell apart and replacing them with difficulty. Entertainment in London was abundant and varied. The theatre flourished, with Drury Lane and Covent Garden serving as the principal patent theatres permitted to present legitimate drama. These great houses staged Shakespeare, contemporary plays, and the musical entertainments that Georgian audiences loved. Smaller theatres, operating under legal restrictions, offered melodrama, pantomime, and variety entertainments. Music permeated London life. Concert halls presented performances by the leading musicians of the age. Opera attracted fashionable audiences to the King's Theatre in the Haymarket. Street musicians performed for coins throughout the metropolis. Pleasure gardens, such as Vauxhall and Ranelagh, combined music with outdoor recreation in settings designed for social display. Popular recreations included blood sports that would later be outlawed as barbaric. Bear baiting and bull baiting still attracted audiences, though reform sentiment was growing. Cockfighting flourished despite periodic efforts at suppression. Boxing, conducted with bare knuckles under rules very different from those of later eras, drew crowds of all social classes and generated enormous gambling interest. Gambling itself constituted a major pastime for Londoners of means. Gaming houses operated openly, offering cards, dice, and other games of chance. The aristocracy might lose fortunes in a single evening at exclusive clubs. Horse racing attracted gambling interest, as did prize fights and other sporting events. Lotteries, both official and unofficial, offered dreams of sudden wealth to those who could afford the tickets. Coffee houses, taverns, and public houses served as social centers for men of all classes. Business was transacted, news exchanged, and friendships maintained over cups and glasses. The alehouse was the working man's club, a refuge from the crowded home and a venue for conviviality. The coffee house served similar functions for the middle and upper classes, with different establishments attracting distinct clienteles. Literature and journalism flourished in London in 1801. Newspapers, though expensive by working-class standards, circulated widely, passed from reader to reader, and available for perusal at coffee houses and public places. The Times, the Morning Chronicle, the Morning Post, and numerous other papers competed for readers with their coverage of politics, commerce, society, and sensational events. Magazines and periodicals addressed every conceivable interest and readership. Book publishing centered in London, with the great houses of Longman, Murray, and others producing works that ranged from serious scholarship to popular fiction. Circulating libraries made books available to those who could not afford to purchase them outright. The reading public was substantial and growing, creating demand that stimulated both literary production and the infrastructure of publishing and distribution. Chapter 5: Economy and Trade. The economy of London in 1801 was the most sophisticated and dynamic in the world. The city served as the financial capital of an expanding empire, the commercial hub of global trade networks, and a manufacturing center of considerable importance. These economic functions supported the vast population and generated the wealth that built the grand buildings and funded the elaborate lifestyles of the prosperous classes. The Port of London stood at the center of the city's commercial life. Ships from every maritime nation called at the Thames wharves, bringing cargoes that made London the entrepot of world trade. The West India Docks, newly constructed and opened in 1802, represented a massive investment in port infrastructure designed to handle the growing volume of tropical produce arriving from Britain's Caribbean colonies. Similar dock projects would follow in subsequent years, transforming the riverside landscape and modernizing cargo handling. The products flowing through London's port reflected the scope of British commercial power. Sugar and rum from the West Indies arrived in enormous quantities, the sweet fruits of plantation labor by enslaved Africans, whose condition was increasingly debated in the British political discourse. Tea from China had become the national beverage, consumed in vast quantities by all social classes. Indian textiles, Chinese porcelain, Baltic timber, Mediterranean wine, and American tobacco all passed through London on their way to British consumers or re-export to other markets. Banking and finance had developed to support this commercial empire. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, served as the government's banker and as the anchor of the British financial system. Private banks, many founded by goldsmiths who had evolved into financial intermediaries, served the needs of merchants, landowners, and the growing industrial sector. The stock market, though not yet formally institutionalized, facilitated the trading of government securities and the shares of the great chartered companies. Insurance had emerged as a major London industry. Lloyd's of London provided marine insurance to the world's shipping, with syndicates of underwriters accepting risks and spreading them across multiple parties. Fire insurance companies, established after the Great Fire, had demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of uninsured losses, offered protection to property owners throughout the kingdom. Manufacturing in London was diverse and dispersed. The city was not primarily an industrial center in the sense that Manchester or Birmingham were becoming, but it supported an enormous range of manufacturing activities. Luxury trades flourished, producing the fine goods demanded by wealthy consumers: silverware, jewelry, furniture, coaches, musical instruments, and countless other products. Printing and publishing employed thousands. Food processing, brewing, and distilling supplied the urban market. Shipbuilding and ship repair serviced the great port. The labor that powered London's economy came from the million inhabitants of the metropolis and from the constant stream of migrants arriving from the countryside. Agricultural change was displacing rural workers, pushing them toward the cities in search of employment. London's labor market was relatively free, with fewer guild restrictions than many continental cities, allowing workers to move between trades and employers to hire according to their needs. Wages in London exceeded those available in most of England, reflecting the higher cost of living and the greater demand for labor. However, the cost of housing, food, and other necessities consumed much of this premium, leaving many workers with little margin against misfortune. Unemployment was a constant threat, as economic fluctuations, seasonal variations in trade, and the disruptions of war all affected the demand for labor. The war with France, which had begun in 1793 and would continue with only brief interruption until 1815, shaped London's economy in profound ways. Military and naval demand stimulated certain industries, while disrupting the trade patterns upon which others depended. Government borrowing to finance the war effort expanded the national debt and created opportunities for those who could invest in government securities. Taxation rose to unprecedented levels, weighing upon consumption and commerce. Despite these challenges, London's economy in 1801 demonstrated remarkable resilience and continued growth. The city's position as the center of global commerce was being consolidated, and the foundations of the 19th century expansion were already in place. The financial institutions, commercial networks, and human capital accumulated over generations positioned London to maintain and extend its economic leadership in the decades ahead. Chapter 6: Politics and Notable Events of 1801. The political life of London in 1801 was dominated by the great questions of war and peace, constitutional change, and the ongoing struggle over the nature of the British political order. The Act of Union with Ireland, which took effect on the first day of the year, represented the most significant constitutional change since the union with Scotland in 1707. This merger brought Irish representation to Westminster, adding 100 members to the House of Commons and introducing Irish peers to the House of Lords. The circumstances of the Union were controversial and would remain so for over a century. The Irish Parliament had been induced to vote its own extinction through a combination of persuasion, patronage, and outright bribery. Catholic Ireland had been promised emancipation, the removal of the legal disabilities that prevented Catholics from sitting in Parliament and holding high office. However, King George III's adamant opposition to Catholic emancipation had already made clear that this promise would not be honored, poisoning relations between the new United Kingdom and its Catholic Irish subjects. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, architect of the Union and Britain's war leader for nearly 2 decades, resigned in February 1801 over this issue. Pitt felt bound by the promises made to Irish Catholics and believed that emancipation was essential to reconcile Ireland to the Union. The King's refusal to consider the measure left Pitt with no honorable course but resignation. His departure marked a significant shift in British politics, ending an era of strong executive leadership and inaugurating a period of weaker governments. Henry Addington, the Speaker of the House of Commons, succeeded Pitt as Prime Minister in March 1801. Addington lacked Pitt's commanding presence and political abilities, but he proved adept at managing the transition to peace that marked the following year. His ministry would negotiate the Treaty of Amiens, which briefly ended the war with France in 1802 before hostilities resumed and Napoleon's threat prompted Pitt's return to office in 1804. The war with France continued to dominate public attention throughout 1801. British forces were engaged in Egypt, where they successfully expelled the French army that Napoleon had left behind after his return to France. The Battle of Alexandria in March 1801 saw British troops under Sir Ralph Abercrombie defeat the French, though Abercrombie himself was mortally wounded. This campaign demonstrated British military capabilities and secured an important strategic position in the Eastern Mediterranean. At sea, British naval supremacy remained unchallenged, though the northern powers presented a new threat. Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Denmark had formed the League of Armed Neutrality, challenging British maritime policies and threatening the Baltic trade, upon which Britain depended for naval stores. The crisis culminated in the Battle of Copenhagen in April 1801, where a British fleet under Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, with Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson as his second-in-command, attacked and defeated the Danish fleet in its own harbor. Nelson's role at Copenhagen entered naval legend. When Parker signaled for the British ships to withdraw in the face of fierce Danish resistance, Nelson famously placed his telescope to his blind eye and claimed he could not see the signal, continuing the attack until Danish resistance collapsed. This combination of courage, initiative, and mild insubordination captured the public imagination and enhanced Nelson's already considerable reputation. The domestic political scene featured ongoing debates over reform and reaction. The radical movements of the 1790s, inspired by the French Revolution, had been largely suppressed through a combination of legal prosecution, the suspension of habeas corpus, and the impact of French revolutionary excesses on British public opinion. However, the underlying grievances that had fueled radicalism, limited parliamentary representation, economic inequality, and restrictions on political and religious liberty had not been addressed. London itself was the scene of numerous political gatherings. Though open opposition to the government was dangerous, the law of seditious libel made it risky to criticize the government in print, and Combination Acts passed in 1799 and 1800 had outlawed trade unions and similar organizations. Nevertheless, the city's coffee houses, taverns, and meeting places hummed with political discussion, and the press, despite legal constraints, maintained a lively commentary on public affairs. The royal family occupied a peculiar position in public consciousness. George III, now in his 60s, had reigned since 1760 and was a familiar figure to his subjects. His bouts of mental illness, now understood to have probably resulted from the blood disease porphyria, had shaken public confidence and raised questions about the succession. His recovery in the late 1790s had been greeted with relief, and his firm stand against Catholic emancipation, while controversial, demonstrated his continued engagement with political affairs. The Prince of Wales, the future George IV, was a far more problematic figure. His dissolute lifestyle, extravagant spending, and scandalous marriage to Caroline of Brunswick provided endless material for satirists and gossips. His political connections to the Whig opposition and his conflicts with his father complicated the political landscape. The contrast between the sober, domestic George III and his flamboyant heir troubled many observers. Scientific and intellectual life flourished in London in 1801. The Royal Society continued its tradition of promoting natural philosophy, as science was then called. The Royal Institution, founded in 1799, was establishing itself as a center for scientific research and public education. Thomas Young, Humphrey Davy, and other brilliant investigators were advancing knowledge in physics, chemistry, and other fields. The arts reflected the broader currents of cultural change. The neoclassical style that had dominated the previous decades was giving way to the romantic sensibility that would characterize the early 19th century. Poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were developing new approaches to verse that emphasized emotion, nature, and the individual imagination. Artists like J.M.W. Turner were beginning careers that would transform British painting. As 1801 drew to a close, London stood at the threshold of a new era. The old century had ended amid war and uncertainty, but also with the consolidation of Britain's position as the world's leading commercial and naval power. The city itself was growing and changing, as it had for centuries, and would continue to do. The challenges of the new century, industrialization, political reform, social transformation, awaited, but the London of 1801 had laid the foundations upon which the Victorian metropolis would rise. Conclusion. London in 1801 was a city of remarkable complexity and vitality. It was the largest urban center in the Western world, the capital of a global empire, and the hub of the world's most advanced commercial economy. Its streets teemed with people of every condition, from the highest aristocrats to the most desperate beggars. Its buildings ranged from magnificent palaces and churches to squalid slums and workshops. The city embodied the contradictions of an age in transition. Ancient institutions and modern ambitions coexisted uneasily. Traditional social hierarchies remained powerful, yet the forces of change were gathering strength. The wealth generated by commerce and empire was transforming the physical fabric of the city, even as the poverty of the masses created conditions that would eventually demand reform. For those who lived through it, London in 1801 was simply home, the familiar setting of daily life with all its pleasures and pains, opportunities and obstacles. The great events that historians would later emphasize, the union with Ireland, the battles of the Napoleonic Wars, the political transitions, formed the backdrop to ordinary concerns of work, family, and survival. Yet these ordinary Londoners were participants in the making of history, contributing through their labors and their lives to the great city that would dominate the 19th century. Understanding London in 1801 helps us appreciate the deep roots of modernity. Many of the institutions, practices, and problems that would characterize the Victorian age and beyond were already present in embryonic or developed form. The city of 1801 was not merely a way station on the road to the present, but a complex, functioning society with its own logic, its own achievements, and its own failures. It deserves our attention not only as a precursor to later developments, but as a world in its own right, worthy of understanding on its own terms.